But thank you for um, agreeing to speak with us. And please tell me your name and where you're from.
Hey, I'm Carl Erickson. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Texas Austin.
And how did you move along in your path in alcohol research? And were there influences in your childhood, even adolescence, maybe high school? Were there people that had a special impact on your progression to become a scientist?
Yeah, Graham, I'd like to start off by just telling the audience that RSA is my favorite meeting. And I think it's wonderful, Graham, that you are doing this history of RSA because it's a very rich history and it teaches us a lot. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that later. RSA, I'm a research scientist. I was trained as a mouse scientist, I like to say, as a basic pharmacologist. And then I moved along and got interested in the treatment of alcoholism based upon my early grants. And then I moved into an area of educating the public about alcohol and alcoholism and how serious it is. So we can get into that story, but for the young researchers out there, I would suggest upfront not to fear changing your path on the way because a lot of people do that. And so if you're tired in one part of your job, try to get out of it and do something else, maybe related where you have some expertise. And then I'll answer your question.
Oh, okay.
Is that all right?
No, that's good. Well, while we're on let's come back to what you mentioned at the very beginning, history of RSA. I was wondering, should we discuss that now, or should we, if we discuss it later, it will fit in with the context of your career?
Yeah, I'd like to start out with the first question, and I think it'll flow a little bit better. Okay. Yeah. So I was training to be a pharmacist in Michigan, a small college called Ferris State. And the idea was my brother was a pharmacist back in my hometown of Manistee, Michigan. And he said, we can open up a store together. So I said, sounds good to me. And as I was going through my education, I found that many teachers can influence what you do. And about my third year of pharmacy school, I was in a lab, and the instructor walked up to me and he said, you're too smart to be a pharmacist. I said, what does that mean? And he said, what I mean is you ought to consider going to graduate school. And so in pharmacology, I didn't have any pharmacology, but the next year I had a pharmacology course, and lo and behold, the instructor said the same thing. I think you're ready for a graduate school. And I said, well, where do you go for pharmacology? And so he pointed me in the direction of Purdue University. And I went there, and at the time, in the College of Pharmacy at Purdue, they had the country's best pharmacology. I was lucky enough to get admitted. I went in there and I got a degree in actually it was behavioral pharmacology. And so I did a lot of work in implanting electrodes in rat and mouse brains. And I was particularly interested during my dissertation in what used to be called the medial forebrain bundle. And it's now called the broadened mesolimbic dopamine system. And that is at the heart of drug problems. So it's a lot of euphoria, reward pathways, and things like that. And that caught my fancy. So graduated from there, got recruited to the University of Kansas. I spent 12 years there. And so you see how one guy in my junior year said, I think you have a different potential. And I've talked to so many scientists who say there was one person who did it for them. And you don't have to wait around for these people. Just look and they come to you naturally if you're good. So then I went to recruited. I was recruited after 12 years at Kansas to go to the University of Texas, where I spent 40 years. And I retired 8 years ago. So today is June 21st, 2026. I retired in 2018 and have not looked back. And it's been a wonderful career. But I still stay connected with RSA. My last time coming to a meeting was 2020. So we saw a lot of great friends at the reception last night. And it's heartwarming to be able to talk to people that you've known for a long time and see that they're still doing well, things like that. At Kansas, I continued that interest in the medial forebrain bundle or the mesolimbic dopamine system, but I also started to ask the question, how does this cause the disease that they call alcoholism? And I don't have any alcoholism in my family. I have one nephew who had to go to Betty Ford Center. He called me up and needed some help. So
It's good. Call you.
yeah, it's good he called me, and it was I followed his journey. He's 14 years sober this year.
That's great.
It's wonderful, and that's a kind of success that we get as scientists. But I didn't understand, in the 1960s, we didn't know anything about alcoholism. You couldn't find it in the literature, except maybe in the liver literature. And so I decided on my own to start attending 12-step meetings. Anybody can go to an open 12-step meeting. I just wanted to hear what they were saying about how they were feeling, what they were dealing with, and everything. And so I was shocked just to go and listen. It was very eye-opening, shed some tears with them and things like that. And so it just kind of caught me. And I wanted to be involved in that research. So when I was recruited to Texas, I continued to do that. But at Kansas, I was doing some basic research, and I was really excited about the intracranial self-stimulation. And then I got to have an interest in how does that pathway, that reward pathway, go bad? And I found out that in order to answer that question, I had to be able to measure small amounts of neurotransmitters that are being released and between the nerve cells of the basal ganglia, corpus striatum, and other areas of the mesolimbic dopamine system. So in Kansas, they had a sabbatical system. So after 8 years being there, they said, "You're eligible for sabbatical. Where do you want to go?" And I said, "That's just the place." And we had invited Ulf von Euler, who is the discoverer of norepinephrine, to a seminar series in Lawrence, Kansas, of all things. He showed up in Lawrence, Kansas. I was chair of the seminar committee, and I got to host him. So I got to be good friends with the discoverer of norepinephrine. He was an older gentleman, and when he left, he said, "If you're ever in Stockholm, look me up, and I'll get you tickets to the Nobel ceremonies." So it turns out that I did some research about Karolinska Institute, which is where he was located, and I found a Department of Toxicology, Analytical Toxicology, run by a man by the name of Boo Homestead. So I contacted Boo and said, "Are you open to having a postdoc or a visiting professor?" And he said, "Come on over, we'll interview, see what you want." Flew over to Sweden, came back, and he invited me back. And so I spent a year, my family and I spent a year in Stockholm. We brought over 2 boys, came back with 2 boys and a girl. She was born over there. We stayed in a foreign scientist apartment complex, and I walked to work every day. And over there, I learned the methodology of GC mass spec, which in 1973, was a brand new thing, especially being able to use GC mass spec for the measures of the nano particles, nano quantities of neurotransmitters that are released in nerve cells. I got to be an expert on GC mass spec, brought it back to the United States, and I was able to get the money for at least partial usage of a GC mass spec that was already at Kansas. And then I published 10 years worth of papers based upon that 1 year in Sweden, fully funded by NIAAA. And my earliest grant was in 1968, after I'd been to Kansas for 3 years. And it took 3 times to get it funded in a easily fundable environment. But it was for the study of how alcohol causes intoxication in the brain. Funded by NIMH because NIAAA didn't exist at the time. NIAAA came in around 1971, 72. And the history of that formation kind of relates to the history of RSA's formation. So let me see.
I have a quick question to
Yes.
Jim. And you said it took 3 times.
Mhm.
I remember when we could apply 3 times with a single grant. Would you be willing to share why it took 3 times?
It's the first grant I ever wrote. I didn't know how to write grants at that time, and so I had to do it on my own. I don't remember if I had any help, but our pharmacology department was fairly well funded, but NIH was not a big deal at the time for our department. So I branched out and I found this, I think, RFA for NIMH wanting alcohol research. And I think that our young investigators would be surprised to know that NIAAA just didn't start the only alcohol research funding, because it was really done by NIMH.
Mm-hmm.
These little tidbits, I think, are really important because it shows how things change, and how things develop, and so forth. So I went to went to Texas, continued my interest in this research, and I was humming along. I was already a tenured professor when I went to Texas. My research was humming along. I had several grants, several labs, and I started to do some transgenic mice experiments. We were really looking for alcohol preferring and non-preferring mice and rats, and so we cultivated some of those strains. And I had a grant from NIDA at that time. I had, I think, another grant from NIAAA to do the brain stimulation work. And I don't know if you've ever tried to do it, but putting electrodes in rat brains and having them actively moving around, pressing a lever and drinking alcohol is not an easy thing, because you get all kinds of movement artifacts and things like that. But we refined that to use platinum electrodes instead of stainless steel, just kind of like the adjustments along the way. And everything was humming along. And then I started to notice that a lot of people were, I started to get invited to, as an expert, an alcohol expert at Texas. They said, "Oh, you're an alcohol expert. Would you be willing to examine some of these blood samples for alcohol?" And I said, "I don't want to get into that." But I did notice that a lot of people didn't know much about alcohol research or alcoholism. And so a colleague of mine that I met in Texas, recovering alcoholic, that time for 40 years, his name was John O'Neill, and some of the listeners of this will remember John O'Neill, because we started doing workshops where science and addiction meet, and we would talk to alcohol and drug abuse counselors, lawyers, judges, anyone who showed up to our talks. We found out they were thirsty for this knowledge. And so in 1994, I went out to the Betty Ford Center and I gave a talk out there, and the president of the Betty Ford Center at that time said, "I wonder if you'd come out and give some more talks to us, because our staff really need to hear about that." So over time, I became kind of like an informal, unpaid consultant for the Betty Ford Center in the scientific area. As anytime they had questions, they knew they could call me, or I could come out and give a lecture, sometimes to the patients who would, of course, fall asleep during the lecture because they're going through withdrawal and things like that. But I got to know that part of the alcoholism picture very well, because I went in 1994 to their professionals in residence program, which any professional can do, by the way. If you're interested in it, you just I call them up and say, "What would it cost me to come out and spend a week on the units with the patient?" So it's an immersion, professionals in residence.
That's current,
Right, it's still going on. And they added later a SIMS program, which is a Summer Institute for Medical Students. And so that's kind of like Betty Ford outreach programs. And they started out with the Southern California medical schools, first year medical students. They'd apply and they'd get a $4,000 grant, a fellowship to cover everything for a week. Covers a hotel, transportation there, meals, lectures, and tuition. And so essentially you're on the units with the patients. So, I'm talking on the patio with a recovering alcoholic. How are you feeling? Great. I said, you're smoking. What's wrong? What are you smoking for? He said, well, one addiction at a time. We take care of the alcohol, take care of this later. Many of them, of course, never took care of the alcohol. I mean, the tobacco problem. But I just learned so much. And then on the last day of the week, they have a graduation day for those people who have been there for X number of days and not coming back. And it's a very moving experience. We are now sending pharmacy students there because they're so open there. They want not just medical students, but they want all health professionals, primarily first-year students. So they get them early. People come in saying, "Oh, this is disease. I don't think much of these people are down. They're down low. People are not good. They don't have any responsibility." And they come out hugging the patients. It's that big a change in 1 week. And our pharmacy students come back and they say, I now I know what to do with my patients that come in and want their refills early, and I know how to talk to them. And they teach them intervention skills and things like that. So it's fantastic. And the SIMS program is now in 3 pharmacy schools. It's in one in Canada, I think in Edmonton, one in Purdue, and one in Texas. And we send a total of about 7 or 8 students a year. And they mingle with the medical students. They get to know them. It's a great interprofessional experience. And so I'm very high on that. But in my particular case with the professionals and residents, I came back and I said, wow, I want to change the direction of my career. And so what I did is I wound down, went to my dean and I said, is it okay if I do this? And he said, well, this is not what I recruited you for, but he said, I get it because I've seen an interest in you in public education. So by that time, I was giving like 26 to 30 talks around the country to audiences here and abroad because I just found, I could do the job. I wasn't a very good communicator at the time, but I could do the job and they liked the information. So I actually, this will be shocking, shut down my 3 labs. I had a NIDA grant off in the middle, and I just made the transition, spent all my time giving talks, writing articles, doing videotapes, going to radio stations, television stations, whoever wanted to know what the latest was in alcohol research. I know there's more to the story, but I want you to ask some questions too.
Okay. As we've gone along, you have been answering some of the questions on my list. So I understand your drive to know the practical sides. Did your pharmacologic observations drive you to that, or did you realize that you needed more? What was there any impact of that pharmacology on your drive to learn and then teach?
Yeah, absolutely. Pharmacology, I think, is the basis of questions that may arise in how to best, I don't like to use the word cure, but that is the long-term goal, to cure alcoholism. And so I had a drive because I met so many people in these AA rooms. I started to meet people in recovery. Some of them became my good friends for a long period of time. And they were always asking, Carl, what's wrong with my brain? Why can't I stop drinking? And I said, I want to find the answer to that. So then it gets back down to, if you look at the Koob and Volkow article, they're really into it. Looking at how different brain areas are involved. And then you get down to the cellular level. And once you know what's going on at the cellular level, better chance to treat it. And that's where the hope of medications come in, new medications, and other methods that might be able to either prevent those chemical changes that drive those circuits to be constantly on or constantly off, not constantly off in this particular case. And so pharmacology naturally has us ask the questions. Here's the disease. Here's what's going on. And here's how to better treat it. So I really think that the answer is going to be in the genetics, which affects the neurotransmitter proteins and protein formation and regulation. And so in my latest book, I'll give a little bit of a pitch here. My latest book was The Science of Addiction, from neurobiology to treatment. And I got a contract. I was lucky. I got a contract from W.W. Norton in New York to write a book like this. And they were shopping it around. I said, I think I can handle that. And I have a lot of contacts still, and IAAA and scientists around so that they could help me form chapters on genetics, which I'm not a specialist in, and other areas, at the psychosocial areas, which I've only recently been learning more about. So they helped me put this book together, and it was the second edition was published in 2018. And this is 8 years later, and I dare say that science hasn't progressed very much since then. So I could almost write another book, but I'm not going to.
When you say the answer is in genetics, do you anticipate genetic interventions to the genetic code or to gene expression? Where do you see that being implemented?
Yeah, as I said, I'm not an expert in this area, but theoretically, if you can change the gene to prevent it from expressing the wrong protein or too many of the right proteins, or particularly disease-associated genes, I think that you have a great chance of modifying those genes somewhere down the road. It has not worked in areas of cystic fibrosis, for example, which is a single gene disease, alcoholism, now called severe alcohol disorder. Alcoholism has, according to my genetics friends, 19 to 21 genes that seem to be associated with it. So this is a multi-genetic disease, which makes it much more difficult to come up with the final answer.
We have ideas and increasingly tools. What challenges did you encounter along this path? And you made some major changes over stages in your life.
I think two challenges. One is I went to every RSA meeting since, I think, 1976. And by the way, there's if the readers on the website, the history of alcoholism is chronicled in an article that is posted on the RSA website by Yeti Israel and Charles Lieber, both of whom I know very well. It was a history of RSA up to 1999. In there, it says RSA started in 1977, but there's some controversy about that. I think maybe it was kind of muddy when it started, and I know a couple of people, particularly basic science researchers who say it really started earlier than that by some RSA. I mean, some people who wanted to form an organization such as RSA. But anything we do know that the National Council on Alcoholism, which was big at the time, it's a national nonprofit organization that was providing small funds to scientists. They were the only source of funding because the IAAA was just getting started, and NCA goes way back into the 1960s. So some of the people who associated with the NCA split off and became RSA, and some of the people, primarily the clinicians, started ASAM. It's called something different at the time. But so clinicians were really very much involved in starting both organizations, but then the basic scientists went off in the RSA direction with a bunch of clinicians who followed them, who were scientifically based. So I think that was a difficult time, to answer your question. I think it was a difficult time in the history of alcoholism research. I was caught up on that. I was on the board of directors of NCA. Yes, I'm that old. David Lewis and I from Brown University were the only two scientists on there at the time, I think. And so we had to constantly keep research in the eyes, accurate research in the eyes of the other board members, were many of whom are just in recovery and were there for their service. Another thing is that because I liked RSA the most, I always went to RSA meetings. I would go to Neuroscience Society for Neuroscience meetings. I like that too. I go to CPDD meetings, but nothing is like RSA. RSA is a special organization. And so sometimes I'd spend a week there. I found out that my wife was wondering why I was spending so much time there when I didn't have to give a paper every day. So we went over a little bit of discussion about that. Finally, she understood. And now she's with me here. She comes with me to every research society on alcoholism meeting, whether it's in a good place or a bad place. When I was traveling around giving talks, she'd say, "No, I won't go to North Dakota with you, but I will go to San Francisco with you, or Anaheim or something like that." So I take her along, and she started to see what I was doing in many of these situations, and so she really appreciated, I think, the things we had to go through as a family, because she was taking care of the kids, and I was off doing my science. I think that relates to many of our scientific colleagues that have worked so hard and go to so many meetings that something has to be given up somewhere along the line. And then I think the third challenge, we got NCA, got RSA meetings, scientific meetings in general. And the third challenge was making that change from one career path to another. I was a tenured professor, and my dean said, tenured professor, you can do anything you want, but he says, I hope you'll still keep up your teaching, still keep up your research and service to the college. The research kind of fell by the wayside because I was just traveling too much and giving too many talks. So those are the challenges that you asked about.
And you brought up a point of your love of RSA and the importance of attending the meetings for you. Could you comment on the importance of attending meetings for junior people?
Right. Even when I go to this meeting, and I've seen it so much in previous meetings, the junior people become very involved and they feel comfortable. I've been to scientific meetings where the junior people stand around talking to themselves in receptions. They don't talk to anybody else. But here, it's very welcoming, and it's almost like a family. And it's very warming, very welcoming. A lot of things focused on postdocs, graduate students, education, how to get involved in government affairs, how to get involved in giving your talks to the public, and so forth. So I was chair of the NAEP committee, National Advocacy Committee, Public Education Committee, for way too long. Nobody else, I think, wanted to be a chair of that committee. But we were really focused on getting scientists, and young scientists in particular, to go out and give talks to the public. Very difficult to do. So that's why I broke off and started to give communication skills workshops, which we haven't talked about yet.
Well, I mentioned to you when we were preparing for this, I was a beneficiary of one of your communication skills workshops.
That's great when people remember it.
Oh yeah, it still affects. I just broke a rule. I said,
I do too.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, it's okay. One minute is up.
All right. You published some with TK Lee. So I know my main intention has been to learn about you and your relationship with the society and alcohol research. But could you comment on what brought the two of you together for that work and how you think it affected you and possibly TK?
Yeah, I've been a friend of TK's for a long time, and we sometimes agreed and we sometimes clashed. Particularly in the animal models area, there was a general consensus when you found alcohol preferring rats that was the same as alcoholism. And because I had been around recovering alcoholics and everything, I said, no, rats don't go to meetings. They don't do any of the stuff that these recovering people do. And so it's not just the drinking, It's not the quantity of the alcohol. It's not the frequency of the alcohol consumption. It's not the preference for alcohol, but it's those are only indicators, but it's whether the alcohol connects in a certain way in your brain with these abnormal areas where the chemistry has gone wrong. And he and I had a little bit of discussion about that. So I don't think I published a paper with him unless I'm forgetting. Maybe you saw it, but I didn't. I've gotten a lot of the papers.
I think I've had one.
Okay, yeah. But we had dueling papers at one time in ACER about the value of animal drinking studies and what their limitations were. And that's what we do in science all the time. That's the way we proceed forward. And he was always the nicest guy because he said, "Come on, Carl, and we would discuss it one way or another." I said, "Come on, TK, like look at this." Well, and I always am surprised that so many alcohol researchers at RSA have never met knowingly or talked to a recovering alcoholic in the way that you have to as a clinician to get to know what they're going through. I'm not a clinician, but I've spent a lot of time around recovering people, and I'm almost a clinician by experience. And so I try to put two and two together, the science with what they're going through. And so this even gets into the area of what is alcoholism, what is a disease, and so forth. I used to get so many questions from my audiences who are non-scientists about, well, why do you think it's a disease? And you have to kind of like go through it, and you go through the criteria. Well, we can diagnose it. We can treat it. It's genetic. It has a genetic component. And so does cancer. And you have to try to get people still say, no, it's a choice. It's really both. Because with the new DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, we've gone from a categorical differentiation between drug abuse or alcohol abuse, drug dependence or alcohol dependence. And I always thought that was that cat's meow. That's great. There are people who make a choice and they can stop anytime they want. There are people who make a choice and can't stop. And it's almost because it's almost like, yeah, well, they could really stop if they just tried harder. And boy, you around severe alcohol dependency patients and cocaine dependent patients and heroin dependent patients, they can't stop. They're on their hands and knees asking God to stop. This is not a willpower problem. And so it's both ways. There are people who drink out of choice, sometimes get into drunk driving situations, kill people. They ruin their livers, their lives, or they lose their families. But if they start to throw up blood someday, and a right physician comes along and said, "How much do you drink?" And they really ask the questions, not just write it down in the history. They really probe and say, "Buddy, the reason you're throwing up blood is you're drinking a case of Budweiser a day." Day? I've been doing that my whole life. No, you're going to die if you do that. The person who does not have a severe alcohol use disorder will say, "I didn't know that." And they just stop, just like that, because it's a big enough adverse consequence for them to stop. The other people who can't stop, it rolls off their back because they really can't stop. One of my best friends is William Moyers Jr., who has written a book called Broken. And he was a CNN anchor for a number of years. He's the son of Bill Moyers, the famous PBS and press secretary for Lyndon Johnson. He's been on PBS all over the place. And William, when I read his book, I started to cry because he had to go through. He became addicted to cocaine, lost his job, and was down and out. Tried treatment 5 times, and nothing ever took until one day his parents confronted him. He had been lost for a few weeks. They finally found him. They confronted him in the streets of the Bronx, right outside his old crack house. And he was in the middle of the road saying, "I died." Picked him up, took him in. He now is he's the vice president of public affairs at Hazelton Betty Ford in Center City, Minnesota. And just to listen to his story is so heart rendering that you can't help but understand what these people are going through. That's the disease. That's so hard for so many people to understand when they really can't stop. I liken it to, I can't stop having a tumor. Yeah, we can try to stop it, but sometimes I can't. Stage 4, you're going to die. And I liken it to people who have voices, schizophrenia, things like that. They have voices. They can't stop the voices. It's not like I turn up my responsibility and my motivation and stop the voices. That's a true disease. Same way with now what we call the new DSM-5 is classification of severity, mild, moderate, severe. Mild and moderate probably are controllable by willpower. This is very simple-minded, but this is the way I think about it, is when you get severe and above, 6 criteria out of the 11 and above, now you've lost control. You need intensive treatment for a long period of time. We don't develop this disease overnight. It's not going to be cured overnight.
What you're describing emphasizes how difficult it is for some people. It also strikes me as having elements of hope that, say, someone with such a severe problem has succeeded. And I wonder if that can be motivating for people who are currently suffering through it.
Absolutely. And it's hard when you have the disease. It's hard to have hope. But I have a genetically driven eye disorder that makes it very difficult for me to see. And I've been told by the retinologist that I've talked to at least 6 over the last 2 years, there's nothing we can do for you. So that's when you start to lose hope. But there are still clinical trials going on that I may be able to participate in. There are other things that with alcoholism, with a severe alcohol use disorder, I have to keep changing my terminology because it's changed over my lifetime. Sometimes I don't like the word alcoholism. I'd say it in my book. I don't like the word addiction. I don't like the word alcoholism because it's totally misunderstood and overused by the general public. Addiction to crab cakes is not the same as addiction to cocaine. And yeah, so so there is hope there, and sometimes it's long-term hope. It's just like pancreatic cancer, God forbid. There's very little hope, but every once in a while we find a patient who has beaten pancreatic cancer. I have a friend who said, I've had 5 different types of cancer, and one of them was pancreatic cancer. And I said, was that properly diagnosed? He said, yeah. And he's conquered pancreatic cancer. Call it prayers, call it advances in medicine, whatever you want to, but sometimes things just happen. And that's, I think, the hope that many people can start to hang on to. But with addiction, we do know sometimes it takes many, many treatments. Intensive inpatient treatments. I'm not talking about outpatient or media driven reductions to drink. I'm talking about severe intervention where it's a holistic situation. You go into Betty Ford, they have 2 days of assessment. They look at every aspect of your life, your spiritual life, your physical ailments, your co-occurring mental disorders, your nutrition, everything. And then they come up with a plan. They customize that for individuals. Used to be able to, you could only go for 30 days. That's what insurance covered. Now you got 90 days is the best outcome because you keep off the drugs for the longer you keep off the drugs in a controlled environment where they're watching you, whether you try to take the drugs outside or whatever. As long as you follow that, the chances are excellent for recovery. I think that's the biggest hope we have.
So I'm going to bend a little bit fast. Have you had any eureka moments?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind is I said we had no alcoholism in my family, but then my nephew called me up. He's a banker, He said, Uncle Carl, I need your help. He said, you helped me get my college roommate into treatment. He says, now I need treatment. And I said, really? Yeah. And I said, what's going on? And so he had anxiety. He was smoking like a chimney. He was drinking too much. His wife finally said, you got to do something. And his colleagues at the bank were starting to notice, when he was gone, and so forth. And he also had hypertension. So I said, yeah, I'll be happy to help you. So because of my connections with Betty Ford, I think they had a waiting list at the time. I'm not sure. They generally will. I got him out there, and then I still remember, and I'm learning about treatment all the time. And he called me up and he said, Uncle Carl, they took my antihypertensives away from me, and they took my Xanax away from me. I'm going to die. And I said, calm down. They know what they're doing. And so guess what? They took those medications away from him. They got him off the alcohol, wouldn't let him smoke as much as they could control it. And high blood pressure went down, anxiety went away, and getting off the alcohol was easy for him. And he and I have discussions. Do you think you were really severely alcohol disordered? He says, listening to you, he says, I probably wasn't, but it was ruining my life. And he says, now I got one other problem left. So the eureka moment was, why don't treatment centers treat both at the same time? If there are overlapping treatment principles, they ought to be applying that. And that's why the best treatment centers we have in the United States and around the world are evidence-based. That depends upon research. Wasn't always that way. We have Malibu treatment centers out there that don't use any of that stuff. They charge people tons of money. They keep them off their drugs. Maybe they let them go shopping on the weekends. And I talked to an executive of one of those treatment centers one time, and I said, well, how can you charge $100,000 a month? And he says, well, sir, we have the Pacific Ocean. We have the patients can go out and meditate. That's part of their treatment. Is that $100,000 worth? He says, no, get it. They will pay for it. They're that desperate. Sometimes the celebrities from the movie industry come up there, have a lot of money, and they went through treatment. They're still going to continue to have problems.
So we see this in other disorders where there are people who will prey on the desperate. That's the same.
Sorry.
So on a kind of a happy note, I think, you said that your first RSA meeting was 1977. And what was that meeting like compared to meetings now?
Obviously, much smaller. I was talking to someone last night about this who went way back, and they were at one of the first ones. And I think the first RSA meeting, anecdotally, the first RSA meeting had maybe 100 people. And then in Wild Dunes, for example, I think it was 500 is what I've been told. All anecdotal. Memory sometimes is difficult. But at the height of RSA meetings, it was 1,600. I don't know what it is this year. So that's a huge growth. Some people say it may have plateaued or gone down. I'm not sure. But the meetings were much more intimate. Everyone knew each other. They probably still people who were there. In the Israel Lieber paper that I mentioned earlier in 1999, they have a list of the original 50 or so RSA members. And I would guess that they are the ones that always went to those earlier meetings. So I think I missed maybe 3 or 4 at the beginning, but ever since then I've gone until 2020. Things have changed. I think I'm seeing the young people more involved. I've seen the quality of the research going up in spite of some federal fiscal constraints. I've seen the use of more intricate instrumentation. I think that has moved along. AI hasn't quite hit us yet, but it will. I've seen more psychosocial research being done. I haven't followed the literature for the last several years. It seems like genetics may have plateaued a little bit. So as you go through meetings, they tend to have different focuses from one year to another. Now we are so interdisciplinary and broad that you can find almost anything. I think there's a symposium here on GLPs, potential for reducing the craving for alcohol. Fantastic. I love that type of stuff. The cutting edge stuff is where I really find the interest. Experiments have to be reproduced to be really sustaining. And so some of these workshops I used to go to in the old days were nothing more than rehashes of other ideas that were out there. Some added a few new wrinkles, but for the most part, they were replicative, which should not be underestimated because you have to replicate these research articles to research findings to be able to make it much more believable. So that's about all I can think of.
Well, that's pretty good. So as you talk, I've been thinking about the importance for junior people, but all of us for attending meetings. And you brought up the breadth of subjects, the interdisciplinary nature. I can imagine if RSA didn't exist, if these meetings weren't held, it would be very easy to be siloed. There'd be brain people, rat brain people. There would be human brain people. There'd be liver people. And we all need to talk with each other and share ideas.
Very much so. And that's where the opening reception comes in. That's where the banquet comes in. I would urge young people to get communication skills. I would urge them to feel comfortable in learning how to meet people. My wife is an excellent socializer. She'll walk up to someone and say, "Hi, I'm Eunice Erickson from Austin, Texas. Well, what do you do?" And she starts a conversation just like that. Pretty soon, if you don't talk too much about yourself and you ask people about themselves, they will eventually, hopefully, if you have enough time in a short interaction, they'll come back and want to know about you. That interaction becomes very comfortable. Some people you can interact with, some people you can't, but the ones you can tend to be lifelong friends, or at least you get to know what they do. Yeah, so communication is really important.
So on the topic of communication, how did you find your way to teaching how to make effective communication?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because when I was in graduate school, my second year, I was attending so many seminars I didn't understand. But that's what graduate students do. They get in there, hopefully they'll listen and learn. I found myself kind of like being overwhelmed. And the second year, my PI came up to me and he says, "You never ask any questions in seminars." And I said, "I don't want to make a fool of myself. I'm not exactly sure what they're saying." And they said, "You will at the next seminar and for the rest of the year, ask questions." I said, "How do I do that?" He says, "You'll figure it out." So somewhere around that time, I decided to I got fed up. And I don't know if it was in graduate school or at Kansas or what, but I started to attend Toastmasters meetings. It's the only way I knew, because there were no communication skills courses for graduate students or young faculty. And it's interesting, we're asked to go into academia, but we're never given the skills to do that. We can't lecture worth a darn. We can't make our slides easy for the students to learn. We can't put ourselves in the student's shoes to see, I don't understand what he's saying. And so at Toastmasters for 2 years brought me up to speed. And all of a sudden, I could speak extemporaneously. I wasn't afraid of asking questions. And that morphed into a communication skills course at Texas, which was a 4-hour oral and written communication skills course that all graduate students and 3 of our 5 departments were required to take. And the other 2 departments, the chair said, "No way are my students going to take your course." So why? It's taking them out of the lab. we are only here to teach them to be scientists. And I said, and we're teaching them the same way we were brought up. And I said, I'm afraid that's a little short-sighted because have you ever heard yourself talk? And he said, what do you mean? I'm a great talker. No, you're not. You didn't learn the basic skills. So we were teaching basic communication skills and everything. And that morphed into the communication skills that my colleague and I started to do around the country. I haven't mentioned this. You mentioned the one I gave at RSA. That was a one-off. They never asked me back for that. But it was highly successful, I'm finding, because people remember it. But we were able to convince people through a contract and in one case a grant situation with NIAAA and NIDA, for my colleague and I to go out and speak to the alcohol centers, the trainee, the postdoctoral trainee programs in both drug and alcohol centers. And so many people come up to me and say, I remember you and John O'Neill coming out, spent 6 hours talking to us, and we get the audience involved. But John O'Neill is my recovering alcoholic friend. And he had experience in media skills training and communication training in the Air Force. So he would stick a microphone in front of a person's a scientist's face and say, tell me about your research in 2 minutes. And they'd start talking about their data collection and statistics. I'm with a TV station. They don't care about this stuff. Tell me what you're doing, why it's important, what's its significance to the audience. Very simple. You can do it 30-second elevator speech if you're really good. And then if you can do it in a radio interview or a TV interview, then you got it. And so we were actually training people. And I remember one person, I think it was at Princeton, stood up, postdoc, and he said, what are you doing? He said, you're 10 minutes into this presentation, and I got to go the other 5 hours. I don't want to be here. What's wrong? He said, you're teaching us to be car salesmen. No, we're not. We're teaching you to be not hard driving car salesmen. We are teaching you to be persuasive communicators that help people to understand what you're doing. Because after all, you are taking money, taxpayer money, in many cases from the federal government, most cases from the federal government, and you deserve to give back. I am a lifetime fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. You pick up any science journal, magazine/journal. First part is a magazine, second part is a journal. And the editorial page, almost once a month, will have scientists must speak out. We got to get it out there. We got to make the Congress people, we got to make the people want the research. And up until recently, it worked. It was a bipartisan thing. The president puts in a fairly laid back or maybe conservative budget, and Republicans and Democrats both increase it for NIH. Everybody's going to get a disease, get sick somehow. They want more research to help them. But it takes a scientist to get out there and push it, to get rid of some of the myths, misunderstanding, the lies that are going on, and the scientists can fix that. Sometimes we just don't want to get out of our labs because we don't feel confident, and that's where communication skills training comes in. So for those who don't have communication skills courses in their graduate training, seek it out for yourself. I would suggest that all young people suck it up, go to Toastmasters, especially if you're shy, you feel nervous, you feel like throwing up before a talk, things like that. Toastmasters is wonderful. And it only takes 1 hour a week, unless you're preparing a talk to give at one of the meetings that takes a little longer. But they cover all aspects. Things that'll make you embarrassed, like too many odds, you knows, okays, I means, all those types of things. They're all non-words that just kind of slow everything down, all the way from there to how to be persuasive in your argument. And Toastmasters is the reason I'm probably here today.
That's, I've often thought that if we don't publish our research, it's as if we never did it. But there's a new aspect with what you're saying. If we don't tell the public about it, for them, it's as if they spent their taxpayer money and nothing happened.
And it also, we used to teach that if you can't effectively tell a colleague what you're doing, you're not as smart as they would like you to think that you are. Because if you can't communicate, there's no way they can tell how great you are. And a lot of people, PhDs have egos. They like to think that they're really good and really great researchers, but if nobody hears the message, it's not going to work. It's a good point.
If we go back to early days. So Debbie Sharp was she was my RSA guide at the beginning, and as I worked on different committees, and she was a constant. I miss her. She was a major source of encouragement. She had institutional knowledge, lasted across decades. So you must have known her well. Should you talk about Debbie a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. And I have to go back a little bit. In 1979, 5 other scientists from Texas and I founded the Texas Research Society on Alcoholism. We are all members of one of the first IRGs in IAAA, all from Texas. And we said, we've had great researchers in alcohol in Texas. Let's form our own state chapter for RSA. The RSA had been formed 2 to 5 years, depending upon who you believe, ahead of that. So we incorporated TRSA in 1979. And they said, Carl, you're the only one from Austin. Can you get us tax-exempt status? I wandered down to the state capitol or wherever it was, and I said, I want to apply for a charitable organization. Go to that window there. I filled out the paperwork, turned it in. You are now a 501c3. One day. These days it takes 6 months. Those are back in the days when things were easy. So we started out, and the mission of the Texas Research, I call it TRSA, Texas Research Society on Alcoholism, was to educate the people of the state of Texas about alcohol research, alcoholism research, and to promote alcohol research, primarily for money for funding graduate students, medical students, health professional students, and postdocs with small grants, $5,000, $6,000, something like that, and to give them a startup or to help them along the way in their research. And so we created and we got a donation from the McGovern Foundation. John P. McGovern was a friend of mine. He was also on the scientific advisory panel for NIAAA. Turns out he was a recovering alcoholic. Millionaire from Houston, has a McGovern Foundation. Many of the institutions that our students and faculty are working in right now will have a McGovern Department of Cardiovascular Research or something, because he had a heart problem. But he was also in recovery, so he's given money to alcohol sources. And so we get money from them every year. We have a golf tournament run by Marty Javers, started by Marty, and he's still running it. And we have a board of 13 members, active members these days. So in 1979 to 2026, I think that's a pretty good run, and we still are in the black, but there were years when we were in the red. Much of our success was due to Debbie Sharp. And so when I set up, so in the days before RSA was located in Austin, and the days before it was always in the office of the president of RSA. And so it would drift from one institution to another, and they'd have to run the budget and all that sort of stuff and organize the meeting. Well, I finally decided that they needed a director. And so in TRSA, we were ahead of them. We already had a director for TRSA. It was housed and the person was, our office was housed in a building, a small office in a building that was donated by one of our board members. We had board members who ranged from scientists to recovery people who were well known in the community, and they helped us open an awful lot of doors. And so we had two directors before Debbie, and Debbie came in. I hired her, and darn it, all of a sudden, Henry Biglighter and TK Lee showed up at our door one day and said, "Debbie, we want you to be first director of RSA." So they stole her from us. But then, because they set up the RSA office in Austin in the same office where TRSA was, Debbie worked both sides of it. And so Debbie is still in our hearts and minds because she was the one who really kept TRSA going in the early days, even through the days of red line budgets and black budgets. And so, but without her, we would not be where we are today and still moving forward. That's a long time for a volunteer board and a volunteer organization to stay viable. We're very happy about it. And by the way, our first fundraiser big fundraiser, which was helped by Debbie in putting it together, was a talk by Betty Ford, and I'm sorry, by Joe Hirsch, MD, who was the one first intervened on Betty Ford, got her into treatment, and helped to treat her. And Joe Hirsch was well known in the community, so we invited him in we gave him an award, and then Betty Ford came in and gave a talk after that. And oh, by the way, Lady Bird Johnson, who was a good friend of Betty Ford, showed up. 2,000 people were at the Hyatt in Austin, and it was the newspapers the next day said that was the first time that recovering people and non-recovering people were in the same room together to listen to a speaker. I found that was really interesting. We made $10,000 on that, which went out the window when Betty Ford charged us $10,000 for a speaking fee that she hadn't told us about. And my board was really angry. And I said, wait a minute, she's not taking that personally. What she does is she puts it into the STEMS program for the medical students, and they get fellowships through that fundraising effort. So, okay, calm down. But at least it showed us what we could do and what we couldn't do.
We're on the topic of Betty Ford. So it sounds like you had a chance to meet her. You knew her, and you've talked about the time at her treatment center. Could you talk some more about that?
Sure.
We're fine.
I was fortunate enough to receive one of the awards that her foundation gave out. It was called the Betty Ford Visionary Award. I didn't know I was visionary, but she did, or somebody did. So they had this ceremony in Dallas, Texas. And so I sat at the table with Mrs. Ford, my wife. Gerald Ford was there. This was after he was president. And it was just a holy cow situation. So I think I knew her maybe one other time, but I was invited to give a talk for their development board in Rancho Mirage, the actual center. And I'll never forget it because there were about 30 influential members, almost all donors to Betty Ford. And so I was up on the stage, and I do this thing, some people have seen me. If you won't mind being a little goofy with me for a while, could you put 2 fingers in the front of your forehead and 1 above your right or left ear, and imagine where those lines cross. And that's where we know addiction occurs in the brain. And scientifically, it's known as the mesolimbic dopamine system. Some people know it as the reward pathway. And I had asked my wife to watch President Ford if he did that, and if Betty did it, because Gerald Ford just had surgery on his shoulder. And I said, I don't know if he's going to do it or not. well, by golly, he was able to do that. And my wife's like that in the front row, and I got the message that he did it. And so it was funny because I couldn't watch my audience very well at the time. I had Slack. So, but it was so much fun. So I got to know her in that way. She passed away while I was kind of still consulting out there. But I knew a lot of the staff and everything. And I knew her daughter, Susan, quite well. Served on a number of boards with her. And salt of the earth people, you would never know he was former president. He was just the nicest person. Betty Ford, the nicest person. They didn't have an air of elegance about them. Overdue elegant. I mean, overdone elegance. They're just easy people to talk to. And that's what we found with so many people who I knew a Nobel Prize winner once. And, it's like, when you talk to them socially, they're the same. We all have two personas. We have our social personalities, our persona of being a scientist. I've seen doctors flip from very, very open to here's your diagnosis in a heartbeat. And so you just go, holy cow, that's almost not the same person. But everybody is human when you talk to them, which should make it easier for people to learn how to speak with other people, because you can network like crazy. You get to know people who are influential. If you're interested in starting a nonprofit, that's the way you network. It really works. Really works much better than. And I know some people have the personality. They only want to be in the lab and look at the data. I get it. But at some point, you have to break out and be social with your family, your friends, and everything. Otherwise, it gets to be too, I think, in my personal opinion, it gets to be too restrictive.
What would you like to see in the future of alcohol research? And what are some of the things, there's what you'd like to see, and what are the things you expect to see?
I want to see the stigma go away with alcoholism and other severe substance use disorders. We got a late start in our funding. I think I've spent 50 years of my life trying to convince Congress that we need the money. I've gone to the Hill. I've testified. In fact, I think that's the only reason I got the Statius Award early in 1991 or something like that, because I was one of the few scientists who were doing it. Now we got tons of scientists who are willing to do that. Couldn't find anybody at that early on. And then and it's all about fighting stigma, because stigma against the victims of this disease reduces the availability for treatment, availability of research funds for prevention, reduces the availability of education, puts a whole bunch of myths out there that need to be overcome by science. And it's a hard uphill battle. I once had a discussion with a NAMI, member, National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They said, we got worse stigma than you do. I said, no, we got worse stigma than you do. And stuff like it. We had to agree that they kind of maybe overlap a little bit, and they're both highly stigmatized. And so I think we're breaking through faster in the mental illness feeling. It's just my feeling. In the mental illness area, we're breaking stigma a little bit faster than we are in the addiction. It's because we still use that word addiction for everything. And people just don't understand that addiction to cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, alcohol, nicotine are serious mental illness. Mental illnesses, I tend to believe that it's a subset of mental illnesses. But it has so much stigma, it keep themselves separate so they can work on their own issues. So without the research, not going to break through that stigma as easily. And it's going to reduce the treatment opportunities for many, many people. So that's a big thing I want to see take care of. In my book, I have a chapter on what I think is coming in the future. I haven't gone back and read it recently, and I don't know how accurate it was, but I think that the genetics is starting to fulfill that promise. That was one of them. Another one was to break the mythology. There's so many myths around drinking because a lot of drinking is haha. The myth that there's more Irish alcoholics than English alcoholics is totally backwards. There's more severe alcohol use disorders, according to epidemiology studies, more patients that are affected by severe alcohol use disorder in England than there are in Ireland. But there's so many drinking stories with the Irish that, and it's fun, good jokes. But when you get serious about it, then got to look at the numbers. So breaking myths and mythology and old wives' tales is really, really important. Another thing I want to see more of is putting funding for NIAAA, NIDA on the same level as cancer and other serious illnesses in this country, cardiovascular. We're way behind. We started late. Gotta get closer and closer and closer. So that's something that's been my passion all along. Never have enough money for alcohol research. If I go out and talk to a large audience and I ask questions, I say, sorry, I can't answer that question. We don't have enough money. I'm actually frank enough to say, you guys got to help us. And so it's trying to get more money for research, big deal. And we're doing a good job of that with RSA because we have a close alliance with NIAAA. George Koob, friend of mine, he's doing a great job. He and Nora Balkow are doing the best they can to raise those budgets. It's not easy, even for the directors, to go in front of of the Congress and make that case, but they're always trying, and we got to help them. Scientists have to help them.
We come back to communication.
There you go.
And that's something I've been impressed with George since the beginning. It's like he's an evangelist for information into the hands of the public.
Mm-hmm.
That will go toward fulfilling the goals that you laid out.
Yeah, in fact, he is one of my inspirations for communication skills because I worked in his lab when he was at Salk. He was at Salk for 3 months, and I noticed that he and Floyd Bloom and others in that lab would always have communication skills training for the scientists. They would have a seminar once a week, as I recall. And George, you can correct me on that one, but no, they were very much into that. And Floyd Bloom had that vision as well. He was editor of Science for a long time, and so we feed on each other, hopefully, and come out with the right motivations. So I'd like to motivate all young alcohol researchers. Talk to people, communicate your research in a way that everyone can understand. You can use the jargon with your scientific colleagues, but with the general public, you gotta make it much more simple, not dumb it down, keep the scientific accuracy, but use different words. Try not to use too many acronyms. Try not to use too many distracting uhs, like I've had a few here today. And so those types of things go a long way. And it makes life a lot easier for scientists as well when they know they have the confidence to stand up in front of an audience and not be afraid of any question that they're asked.
So you've mentored people who become noted alcohol researchers and researchers in other areas. Would you describe your thoughts about mentorship, philosophy of mentorship?
Yeah. I have to be frank. I never had a lot of postdocs. I think I had one or two, but I ran a relatively small lab. But I have been on many doctoral dissertations, and so I kind of showed some mentoring skills that way. Ruben Gonzalez is one of our famous graduates out of the University of Texas. He actually worked for former RSA member, highly successful scientist by the name of Steve Leslie, who had a merit award with NIAAA. and he was a dean of pharmacy in our college. He was also provost of our university, and he was also in the chancellor's system after he semi-retired. And so he was Ruben's mentor. And my mentoring philosophy is to always respect the student, make sure that they're interested in wanting me to guide them in the laboratory on something that we were both interested in. I've found some mentors who say, go to the lab and bring me the data next week. I don't think that works in my case. I had to be in the lab asking about the data every day. And I want my graduate students to learn from my technicians and other people who have been around the lab for quite a while. And then I expect our graduate students to mentor undergraduates who come in and kind of like hopefully pull them into the field. So it's a kind of like a multi-level mentoring system. And I don't think I'd ever win a mentorship award because I didn't spend a lot of time in that, because I had relatively few graduate students as compared to other big labs.
So a positive perspective. So, for researchers at the start of their careers, do you have any advice to offer? We talked about communication. Do you have more on that or other advice?
I've taught many graduate courses, many graduate students, I guess the only thing that really hits me right now is that graduate students have to understand that when they go into graduate school, it's going to be a lot of work. I was associate dean for graduate studies and research in our college, and many of our other faculty, not in the alcohol research field, and particularly in other disciplines, would really just turn their graduate students loose in the lab to be mentored by postdocs or others. And so I think graduate students have to understand that they can be assertive, and if they're not getting what they want in that laboratory, that they should change labs or at least talk to their PI and say, can you give me more guidance, or can I see you a little bit more often? I know you're very busy, but can I see you more often than I see you right now? So be assertive, make sure you know what you want, work hard, 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week. You should be able to do that even these days. Be prepared to give up some things with the family if you have a family, if you have a spouse and children. You have to kind of give up, make sure that the family understands what you're doing and how hard you have to work. And to give yourself every opportunity to learn whenever you can. Don't sit around reading the journal article when you can go down the lab, go down the hall and peek into another lab, ask them what they're doing, things like that. One of my most productive graduate students was the first one I had at Texas. His name is Mark Goldman. He came in with some lab skills from another alcohol research lab, and so he was up and ready to go. And he ended up with 7 peer-reviewed published papers by the time he got his PhD, because he would go around to different labs and why don't you use HPLC for that instead of GC, and I'll help you set it up. And he would help the lab, and he would learn what they're doing. And the breadth of his knowledge was fantastic, just because he was curious. And you have to be curious if you're a scientist. You have to be asking, why is this happening? How's this going to affect people? How's it going to affect the data that I'm getting, and so forth? So probably that, I talked myself into this, that I think that's probably the biggest thing, is be curious and be energetic and motivated.
I would agree.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking the long hours that I worked were driven by a fire, not just a deadline. Wanted to be in there and learn and get things done.
Right. And I'm not going to even say don't procrastinate, because there are effective procrastinators. I'm one of them. I wait up until the last deadline and I work like crazy. It's hard on the nervous system, but that's the only way that some people can work. And so others are planners. Figure out what kind of a personality you have and stick to that personality and plan ahead when you need to. Make sure you have time to get something done, just in case you get sick at the last moment. You don't want that to happen.
Mhm. So for researchers in general, is there anything that you would ask of us?
Go back to communication skills. Don't be afraid to get some communication skills training. And if you don't have it in your institution, either create a course and you'll learn on the go. I learned many of my communication skills by teaching others. And I would bring in examples of videotapes. I used to have videotapes of Seinfeld. How to do proper gestures. You look at George on Seinfeld. I'm that person. I'm here. Come in. He's always waving his arms. He would say, George is going to be good this week. This is the summer of George and things like that. And so I would play videotapes to illustrate to the students that this is what gestures are like. It's not this. It's not standing with your hands in front of your crotch. Those types of things. When you're up in front of people, you got to be aware of the gestures that are meaningful. And even a lot of politicians these days just do the same thing over and over when they're talking. Those are not effective gestures. But you don't have to be like George on Seinfeld to have those exaggerated gestures, just a nuance of changing your hands around, moving around when appropriate on the stage and things like that. And so if you're a researcher and you have experience, still be open to polishing your communication skills and teaching your students how to be a better communicator. Don't teach them just the way that you were taught. Teach them to be better than you are. We want our kids to be better than us. If you want them to be clones of you, then you're not doing service to your kids or to your students. And so that's something I know everyone doesn't agree with, but that has been successful in my life. I want my kids to be much more successful than I have ever been. And 2 out of the 4 are doing it. And the other ones are on their way.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
For members of the public who may watch this video, is there anything you'd like to say directly to them?
Yes. Think of the people who we're doing research for, the recovering community. I hope we all have that goal in mind, at least way down the road somewhere. We're doing the research to help others. And please understand that science is targeted in that direction and that we are trying our darndest to help people get better, to either prevent disease or overcome diseases. And this disease that we're talking about is a serious one that strikes so many people in the United States, both with alcohol and with other drugs, often in combination with mental disorder. And try to get rid of your biases against these people, help them. May happen to you in your community, in your family, your friends. Don't back away from them. Try to help them. I've had successfully overcome cancer. And in my family, we were brought up, my parents, my brother, we were brought up not to talk about weaknesses that were perceived as diseases at the time. I didn't know my niece was epileptic until she was 21 years old because her parents thought it would show that she was weak. I remember my father dying of throat cancer, and they told me he had a throat disorder. So they were afraid I would spread the word that my father died of cancer. All diseases go through the same phases. We're going through the same phase with addiction. We have been doing for a long time. Think of these people as victims. I know they tend to act poorly in many cases and want to back away from them. But for the people who are truly severely disordered, according to psychiatric criteria, we have to give them all the help we can and think of them just as if they were a cancer patient. You'd want to help them. These people don't abandon.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about?
We've covered so much, Graham. You are so thorough. I think we've done almost everything we can today. So I really appreciate being asked to do this, and I appreciate you again for doing this.
Yep.
I told Graham when we first got together today that our board of directors and RSA has been talking about doing something like this for at least 10 years that I can remember, and you're the first one to step forward and do it. This is what you should be committed for.
Yeah. Thank you for that and for taking the time. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
I did too.